Yorkshire, 1821. The storm gathered almost without warning. At least it felt that way to Lavinia, though she was no stranger to the north's fickle skies. Seated inside the carriage, fingers clasped tightly in her lap, she watched the rain streak the fogged glass in impatient drumming. Her thoughts kept circling back to Daniel, how he had said goodbye without truly giving her one, how he'd avoided her gaze at the last moment, how the words that should have passed between them had hung heavy and unspoken. She wondered whether weeks away from him would bring relief, or simply a different form of loneliness. Outside, the coachman barked a sharp command at the horses, already restless under the grumble of distant thunder. Lavinia barely had time to lift her head before a bolt of lightning struck so close that the world burst open in white. The horses bolted. The coachman shouted something the wind swallowed whole. The carriage lurched violently, wood groaning under the force of panicked hooves. Lavinia clung to her seat, but the ground seemed to vanish beneath her. Everything tilted, everything shattered. The scream trapped in her throat never found its way out. When silence finally returned, it carried with it a hollow so deep that for a fleeting second Lavinia felt even her own name slipping from her grasp, as if the storm had taken more than her breath. Far away in London, Daniel would receive the news 3 days later, carried by a messenger sent in haste by the magistrate of the nearest town who was handling the accident. Not as an aristocrat searching for his wife, but as a man who was only now understanding, far too late, the cost of not loving well. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It truly helps bring more romances like this to life. And tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you watching? I absolutely love knowing how far our stories travel around the world. Lavinia, Duchess of Somerville, had learned early that some silences weighed more than harsh words ever could. The silence in her marriage was of that kind, polite, flawless, stretched across every corridor and every meal like an invisible curtain. Daniel Crewe, her husband, carried the world with the exact posture of a duke, steady, reserved, governed by duty. And somewhere beneath the demands of that inherited role, there seemed to be less and less room for her. There were no fights, no cruelty, just a distance polished as carefully as the family silver. Lavinia respected him, perhaps too much, and that made it all the harder to admit, even to herself, that on certain days she felt more like a guest than a wife. She performed her duties with the grace expected of a lady, yet a quiet question pulsed beneath every gesture, one she never dared voice. Is this all life intends for me? When the invitation arrived from an aunt she had not visited in years, Lavinia saw in it a chance to breathe. Not an escape, an interlude. A small pocket of space in which she might remember who she had been before becoming a duchess, before the rules and watchful eyes and measured words. On the morning of her departure, she stepped into the carriage with gloves still damp from the dawn. Daniel remained on the stone front steps, offering her nothing more than a restrained nod. Not unkindness, simply habit, the manner in which he lived his life. And it was precisely that, the ease with which he let her go, that tightened something inside her. The quiet fear that he might not truly feel her absence at all. She had no way of knowing that, in a matter of days, the world would place that absence before him in the most brutal manner imaginable, and nothing in the life they shared, however quiet, would remain the same. Chapter 1. The Hollow That Remains. Lavinia woke with the bitter taste of iron on her tongue and the distant echo of a woman's voice calling a name, one she didn't recognize, though some instinct insisted she should have. She tried to open her eyes, but the light cut through her vision like a blade, sharp and merciless, forcing her to retreat behind her lids again. Pain arrived in waves, her shoulder, her temple, her ribs. Each breath scraped painfully along her chest. But there was another kind of pain beneath all that, silent, cavernous, as if an entire part of her had been scooped away. Easy now, dear. Don't try to move. The voice belonged to a middle-aged woman, firm yet gentle, with work-roughened hands that spoke of a life sustained by labor. The damp cloth she pressed to Lavinia's forehead smelled faintly of cool well water. Lavinia blinked, trying to steady the shifting face before her, but everything moved slowly as if the world around her was submerged. Where am I? The question sounded foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. In Millbrook, my flower, A village not far from Wetherby. The woman dipped the cloth again, wringing it out with practiced ease. Your carriage overturned on the road yesterday, in the storm. We found you by the stone fence. She hesitated then, and the silence that followed was too heavy to be anything but grim. The coachman didn't survive. Lavinia's chest tightened, yet no grief came, no shock, only a sharp, cold fear, the fear of feeling nothing at all. No face rose in her mind, no voice, no memory of the man who had died. I should remember, I should feel something, but she didn't. I don't... She reached for something far away, something that slipped through her fingers the moment she tried to grasp it. I don't recall anything. The woman frowned softly, then placed a steadying hand over Lavinia's. It was a rough hand, lined and strong, yet its gentleness made Lavinia cling to it as though it were the only solid thing left in a world cracking apart beneath her. You don't remember the accident? Lavinia forced her eyes open, panic blurring the edges of her vision. I don't remember anything. The woman, Mary, as she soon introduced herself, leaned back slightly, surprise flickering across her features before giving way to concern. Dr. Fletcher was here this morning, Mary said quietly. He examined you, said you struck your head hard, a severe concussion. He'll return later to check on you. Lavinia tried to breathe deeply, but the air felt too heavy. When she moved her arm, something glinted beneath the blanket. A silver necklace, bent slightly on one side, hung around her neck. The chain was scratched, as though it had been yanked. We found this with you, Mary explained, brushing the pendant lightly. It was caught in your dress. Thought it best to leave it where it was in case it meant something to you. Lavinia touched the cool metal. A shiver ran through her. Not quite a memory, but a hurt. A deep, inexplicable ache, as though the object belonged to someone important, or as though it had been placed there by someone she should have remembered. Something passed through her then, silent, piercing, and she drew a quick breath. For the first time since opening her eyes, she understood that the absence in her mind was more than blankness. It felt like grief without a name. The room was small and smelled faintly of soup simmering somewhere unseen. The low ceiling and dark beams made everything feel close, contained. Lavinia looked at her own hands, pale, delicate, with faint marks on the fingers that had no place in a life like this, in a village like Millbrook. I'll let you rest now, Mary said. Tomorrow we can ask around the village. Someone may know you. Perhaps your family is already searching. Family. The word sliced through her like ice, waking a fear she did not understand. Mary extinguished the lamp and slipped out, closing the door with careful quiet. But the moment the latch clicked, the room seemed to shrink. Silence thickened around her. The hollow inside her stretched wide, not with hope, but dread. Dread that someone was out there looking for her. Dread that she wouldn't recognize the face of whoever found her. Dread that the past would arrive, and she would not be able to go back to it. Lavinia pressed her forehead to the pillow, breathing shallowly. Then it happened. A flicker. Not a memory, just the shadow of one. A name. Or almost a name. Masculine. Weighted with feeling. She reached out instinctively, fingers curling in the air, as if she could catch it. But it broke apart before it formed, slipping away like light through cupped hands. And the empty space inside her grew again, vast and echoing, ready to swallow her whole. Chapter 2. The News That Breaks. Daniel was in his study when the letter arrived. The mahogany desk, usually immaculate, was buried beneath ledgers, contracts, and reports awaiting his signature. He reviewed them with his customary precision, because precision was how he kept the duchy in order, how he kept himself in order. But that morning his mind kept drifting. It returned again and again to the carriage that had left Somerville 3 days earlier, carrying Lavinia north. Each night since, he had told himself the tightness in his chest was mere fatigue or concern over coastal repairs. Yet every evening, once the house fell quiet, he found himself standing before the window, staring down the empty drive as though expecting her carriage to reappear. He didn't know what he expected. He only knew that something inside him had felt wrong from the moment she left. Your Grace. Henrik stood at the doorway, his voice lower than usual, too controlled. A letter. From the magistrate of Wetherby. The messenger is exhausted. Daniel looked up sharply. Henrik's did not rattle easily. His tension was the first true sign that something was about to break. Daniel took the envelope. The seal was cracked at the edges, as if it had been pressed shut in haste. The lower corner of the paper was damp. Rainwater. A bad sign. He opened it. The first lines had been written by a hand that had clearly rushed. A fragment of the Somerville crest found among the wreckage. Torn from the carriage door. The storm. The overturned coach. The coachman. Dead. He paused. A single second, stretched taut as wire. He read on. No passenger was found inside the carriage. The air punched out of his lungs. He blinked, reread the line. And again. A third time brought no mercy. No passenger was found inside the carriage. The ink seemed to seep into the paper like diluted blood. Henrik stepped forward cautiously. "Your Grace, shall I fetch the physician?" "Orsha?" Daniel didn't answer. His mind had been flung back to the morning of Lavinia's departure. Her dark blue dress, her simply pinned hair, the gloves she adjusted with trembling fingers before stepping into the coach. He remembered his own words, too formal, too brief. Safe travels. Nothing more. No request for her to write. No reassurance. Nothing that might have told her. "Ready the carriage," Daniel said at last. His voice was firm, but the floor felt unsteady beneath him. "2 spare horses, and send riders to every village as far as Harrogate. Inform everyone, ask for any sign, any hint, offer reward." Henrik's bowed, visibly relieved to be given clear orders. "Immediately, Your Grace." When the butler hurried out, Daniel remained where he was, leaning forward over the desk as though the polished wood could keep the world from tilting entirely. The papers before him, weeks of decisions, accounts, obligations, had lost all meaning. Lavinia was somewhere. Perhaps injured, perhaps alone, perhaps— He shut his eyes. Only for a moment, letting fear seep through the cracks in the armor he had worn for years. A fear so deep it felt old, long buried, waiting for an excuse to surface. And with it came a memory. Her voice soft on a night when he had almost reached for her hand and then retreated. "Sometimes I feel as though I'm here, but you don't see me." The words struck him now with brutal clarity. He had lost her long before the storm. Lost her to silence, to separate dinners, to the weight of a title he had allowed to grow between them. To every moment he had chosen duty and overlooked the woman who shared his name. But not now. Not this time. Daniel straightened, folded the letter once, tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat and strode into the corridor. The house had already erupted into motion, servants rushing, voices calling orders, stable hands preparing horses. Yet beneath all that urgency, something inside him was quietly collapsing. The composure he prided himself on, the distance he had cultivated, the control he had mistaken for strength. For the first time, it was not the Duke who acted. It was the man. A man who finally understood, with a fear that felt almost like prayer, that he was not merely searching for the Duchess of Somerville. He was searching for Lavinia. And he would not fail her again. Chapter 3. Among Strangers and Shattered Pieces. Lavinia woke on the third morning without knowing it was the third. Time had dissolved for her. No yesterday, no tomorrow, only a blurred present, stretching out like mist with no edges. The physician had returned twice already. He had spoken gently, but with the confidence of someone who had seen such injuries before. "Your memory will return," he'd said. "It may take days, it may take weeks, but I saw nothing to suggest permanence." The mind protects itself after a blow. He tapped his temple lightly, and sometimes it takes a while before it opens the door again. Then, lowering his voice so only she could hear, "Don't be frightened if the first things that return are sensations. A scent before a face, a feeling before a picture. That's the way of it. But don't force anything. Memory is like mending a torn thread. Pull too hard and it breaks again." He packed his instruments, left simple instructions for rest, and closed the door with an almost ceremonial quiet. Mary, widowed for many years and long used to living alone, moved through the small cottage like a steady little lighthouse, porridge steaming in the morning, warm bread at midday, soup when the sky turned the color of slate. While she swept or kneaded or stirred, she spoke of the villagers as though offering snippets of life to anchor the silence. The blacksmith who laughed too loudly, the miller's daughter soon to be wed, the promise of a good harvest. Lavinia listened, but everything passed through her like water through spread fingers. Not from indifference, but because she herself felt distant, like a shadow attempting to inhabit a body that did not yet feel like hers. "You must eat more," Mary urged that morning, sitting at the edge of the bed with a bowl of soup in hand. "Doctor says strength helps everything else come back into place." Lavinia lifted the spoon. The scent, strong, bright with herbs, sparked something small and startling inside her. A flash of warmth, a winter afternoon, hands curled around a similar bowl. The fragment vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only a thin ache of loss. "Mary." Her voice was rough, dry. "How do you know someone might be looking for me?" Mary smoothed her apron, hesitating. "Your clothes," she said. "Silk, lace. Nothing common here." She reached into her pocket and drew out a small object. "And this." A gold ring, delicately wrought, set with a deep green stone. She placed it in Lavinia's hands with care. "You were holding it so tightly when I found you. I had to pry your fingers open, one by one." Lavinia raised the ring toward the light. A sudden warmth ran up her palm, almost a tremor, not a memory but a wound she could not name. She turned the ring over, searching for an engraving, a mark, anything. Nothing, only the quiet gleam of the stone. "Is it a wedding ring?" she asked, her voice tangled around questions she could not shape. "It looks like one." Mary's gaze softened. "So there may be a husband, and a husband doesn't stop looking for a missing wife." Husband. The word entered her like something cold and wrong. And yet, there was an echo buried somewhere beneath the fog, the weight of a hand over hers, a low, steady voice, a presence. She closed her eyes, trying to hold on to it. It slipped away before it could take form. "I feel as though—" She opened her eyes, meeting Mary's. "As though there's something I'm supposed to remember, but it hurts even to try." Mary laid a comforting hand over hers. Sometimes memory hides until the body is strong enough to bear it. But Lavinia wasn't certain she wanted it to return. A strange unease was growing inside her, not the fear of forgetting, but the fear that forgetting served a purpose. That it was not merely loss, that it was protection. That afternoon, Mary helped her stand for the first time. Her legs trembled but obeyed. They walked slowly to the window. The glass was cool beneath Lavinia's fingertips. Outside, Millbrook unfolded in its simple living way. Stone cottages, dark rooftops, children chasing chickens, women hanging linens, a cart rattling by at an unhurried pace. An entire world, just not hers. She watched it as one might watch a painted scene, lovely, complete, and unreachably distant. Something tightened inside her chest. Not longing. One cannot miss what one does not remember. But absence, a hollowness with no name. "He'll come," Mary murmured beside her. "If he cares for you, he'll come." Lavinia didn't answer. She curled her fingers around the ring, and then she felt faint, almost imperceptible, a pulse of emotion rising from somewhere deep. Tenderness, perhaps. Or sorrow. Something old. Something bruised. Something her mind refused to let surface. And if he comes, and I do not wish to return, or worse, what if my heart flinches the moment I see his face? Lavinia pressed a hand to her chest, counting the steady rhythm beneath her palm. She was alive. Each heartbeat reminded her of that. But for the first time since she had awakened in that strange little room, a thought settled over her like a whisper. Perhaps the forgetting was not only the result of the fall, perhaps it was a refuge. And as she looked out at a village that was not her home, and down at the ring that suddenly felt heavy with secrets, that whisper took shape as something close to truth. Sometimes forgetting hurts less than remembering. Chapter 4. The Search That Devours. Daniel had long stopped counting the doors he'd knocked on, or the faces that stared back at him with polite confusion, or the number of times he'd spoken Lavinia's name, each syllable a plea, a thread of hope, only to be met by silence. 3 days from London, 6 villages, dozens, no hundreds of questions. and not a single trace of her. It felt as though Lavinia had vanished into the world itself, carried off by the same wind that had torn her carriage from the road. Now, in Thornwick, the rain had begun again, thin, persistent, sinking cold fingers through his coat. Daniel dismounted, ignoring the sharp pull in his muscles. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The carriage had been left behind in the previous village. The roads had grown too narrow to bear it. From here on it was only 2 horses, Burton, and a tightening fear that pressed against his ribs like iron. The innkeeper appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a frayed cloth. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with hurried respect. "If you'd like a hot meal, I need information." The words came out sharper than intended. From his pocket, Daniel withdrew the sheet he'd carried since the second village, a description of Lavinia. A description he'd written late one night, only to realize with a quiet horror how little he had truly observed. He'd filled in what memory could provide and discovered how painfully insufficient it was. "My wife disappeared after a carriage accident on the Harrogate Road," he said. "4 days ago. Brown hair, fair complexion, slender. She may be injured." The innkeeper studied the page, then returned it with a slow shake of the head. "No one like this has come through Thornwick, Your Grace. But I can ask around. Folks hear things even when strangers don't." Daniel nodded, swallowing the urge to demand answers where none existed. The fault was not here. It had begun long before this journey. Inside the inn he sat by the fire and ordered ale he had no intention of drinking. The flames glowed steadily, but he felt none of their warmth. Something inside him had frozen the moment he'd read the magistrate's letter. Where is she? The question pounded through him like a second heartbeat. Was she wounded, lying in some unknown cottage, being tended by strangers who did not know her name? Walking alone, trying to find her way back to a home that, God help him, might never have felt like one. Or worse, the possibility he refused to let fully form, because giving it shape would make it real. He dragged a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of beard he hadn't bothered to shave. His hands, accustomed to signing contracts, managing estates, exercising control, now felt painfully useless. Hands that had held hers so rarely he could not remember the shape of that touch. A memory struck him. Lavinia, the night before their wedding, standing near a window, quiet in a way that felt like waiting, as though she hoped someone, anyone, would call her by her name, not her title. He had never called her, never known how. "Your Grace?" The soft voice pulled him back. A young maid stood before him, fingers twisting in her apron. "Mr. Garrett said you were searching for someone." Daniel rose so abruptly the chair scraped the floor. "My wife," he said. "Tell me what you heard." The girl took a steadying breath. 3 days ago, a travelling merchant passed through. He said he'd seen a carriage overturned on the road near a village called Millbrook. He mentioned bodies. Her voice wavered, but also said he'd heard whispers that a woman had been found alive. Someone from the village took her in. That was all he knew. Millbrook. The name landed in Daniel like an arrow finding its mark. "Where is it?" "Northeast of here. 35 kilometers, perhaps. Small place. Folks don't speak of it much." Daniel was already placing far too many coins on the table, more than she'd earn in weeks. "Thank you." He was out the door before she could reply. Rain lashed against him, cold and punishing, but he swung into the saddle with renewed purpose. Burton mounted beside him, alert. "Northeast," Daniel said. His gaze never left the road ahead. And he rode. Rain stung his face, mud splashed up the length of his boots. The cold sank through bone and sinew. None of it mattered. With every stride of the horse beneath him, one promise echoed through his mind. If I find her, when I find her, I will not be the man who let her leave. Not the man who hid behind silence. Not the husband who mistook distance for duty. Not the cold, dutiful figure who'd watched her go with nothing more than a polite farewell. The idea of losing her forever was unbearable, but the idea of finding her only to remain unchanged, that was worse. For the first time in his life, Daniel faced the crushing weight of his own failings, and the terrifying possibility that he might not deserve forgiveness. But he kept riding. Through rain and dark, over rough ground and narrowing paths, he pressed forward with the one truth that fueled him like fire. Lavinia was alive. somewhere, and he would not stop, not sleep, not breathe, until he brought her home. Chapter 5. Fragments of Who She Was. In the days that followed, Mary insisted that Lavinia rest. The village doctor returned twice, each visit marked by his quiet concentration. During his last examination, he checked the bruise at her temple, watched how her pupils tightened against the lamplight, and asked her to repeat simple words, slowly, carefully. "There's still some fog," he murmured to Mary, though his gaze never left Lavinia. Not unusual. Deep memories take the longest. First the body recalls itself, then the world around it, and only then what the heart has kept. He straightened, tucking his rudimentary instruments back into a worn leather bag. Nothing should be forced. Patience will do more good than any remedy. When he left, the cottage felt suddenly too quiet. That evening, Lavinia sat near the hearth, her hands busy with a scrap of worn fabric, one of Mary's work dresses that needed mending. She didn't know whether she knew how to sew, but her fingers did. They moved with natural precision, each stitch small and neat, elegant in a way that felt at odds with the humble cloth. As if her body carried memories her mind could not yet reach. "You've had training," Mary observed, leaning closer. "No village girl learns that stitch. Only a strict teacher drills it in." The word teacher slid through Lavinia with a thin thread of melancholy. Someone had taught her, someone patient, someone she had loved, or lost. The memory came like a faint outline, candlelight, the scent of lavender, a gentle voice guiding her, and then it vanished. "I feel as though that person isn't here anymore," she whispered. Mary paused, her expression softening. "Perhaps it was your mother." Lavinia closed her eyes. She tried to pull on the thread of that possibility. For a brief moment she felt it, warm fingers guiding her smaller ones through clumsy childhood stitches, a sense of care, quiet affection. Then the image shattered like frost breaking underfoot. "It's like trying to see through iced glass," she said, frustration tightening her voice. "I make out shadows, but I can't reach them." Mary returned to the pot simmering over the fire. "Memories run when we grab for them too hard," she said gently. "Let them come on their own." Lavinia wanted to believe her, but something inside her whispered a different truth. Her memories weren't lost. They were locked behind a door she wasn't sure she wanted opened. Later, Mary suggested they go outside. Lavinia's legs still trembled, but they obeyed. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. As she breathed it in, something inside her eased, like she'd spent too long behind quiet walls, in rooms without enough air. "Fresh air heals more than medicine," Mary promised. They walked to the stream. Water slid clear and bright over mossy stones. Mary knelt to fill a jug, while Lavinia leaned over the stillest patch, where the surface mirrored her back like a fragile sheet of glass. Her reflection stared back, brown hair with a soft wave, pale skin, eyes far too full of questions. She touched the water. Her reflection broke apart. "Mary," she said softly, not lifting her gaze, "do you think my husband will come?" Mary rose slowly. "If he's an honorable man, yes, and judging by that ring you wear, he'll have the means to search." Lavinia's fingers tightened around the ring hanging from the cord Mary had fashioned. The gold felt cold, cold enough to sting. "And if he doesn't want to?" The words escaped on instinct. "What if I don't matter to him?" Mary hesitated. Her silence was more honest than anything she could say. "A woman of your standing wouldn't be traveling alone," she answered finally. "Not without a lady's companion. Something about that isn't right." Both of them knew it. Lavinia pressed the ring to her palm. A fragment of sensation flickered through her mind. Brief, raw, a man's hand brushing hers. Steady but distant. A gesture too reserved to be affection, too formal to be tenderness. She inhaled sharply. The fragment disappeared like smoke. That night, in the narrow bed, the weight of the emptiness returned. She held the ring against her chest, letting unspoken questions rise and fall like waves. Had he been kind or severe? Had he spoken to her or spoken past her? Did she smile in his presence or merely survive beside him, the way someone learns to breathe in windowless rooms? A single tear slid down her temple. She lifted her hand to her heart, feeling its steady pulse, insistent, alive, reminding her that she existed, even if everything inside her felt made of fragments. Outside, wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere beyond that darkness, a horse trudged through mud, ridden by a man who had not abandoned her, though she did not know it. Touching the ring, Lavinia felt again the strange freedom born of forgetting, a freedom so bright it was almost dangerous, so right and wrong at once, so sweet and unsettling, so hers, and not hers at all. Chapter 6. The Encounter. Daniel reached Millbrook just before dawn. The sky was a deep, heavy grey, the kind that swallowed the horizon, and a fine rain had turned the village into a damp smudge between the rolling hills. It was smaller than he had imagined, little more than a line of stone cottages, a church with a slightly crooked tower, and a well in the centre of a mud-packed square, the sort of place where every life was known, where no stranger arrived unnoticed. He dismounted, legs stiff from unbroken days of riding. Burton, faithful as ever, followed a step behind, equally exhausted yet alert as he tended to the horses. Daniel wasted no time. "Ask the villagers," he said, his voice roughened by fatigue. "Any scrap of information. I'll speak to whoever is awake." Burton bowed and moved off. Daniel crossed to the nearest figure he could find, a stooped man carrying firewood toward his door. "Forgive the hour," Daniel began, removing his hat in a gesture of strained courtesy. "I am searching for a woman. There was a carriage accident several days ago. A wounded lady was brought here. Where is she?" The man studied him carefully, taking in the soaked cloak, the aristocratic bearing beneath it. Only after a long moment did he answer. "And who might you be, sir?" "I am the Duke of Somerville," Daniel said without hesitation. "The woman is my wife." The man cleared his throat, glanced at the ground, then jerked his chin toward a small stone house at the end of the lane. "She's there with Mary Kettering. Mary took her in, but—" He hesitated, beard twitching. "Best you see for yourself." Daniel didn't wait for more. He crossed the village at a near run, heart hammering so hard it almost hurt. "She is alive." The words beat inside him like hoofprints on frozen earth. "She is alive. I've found her. She is alive." He knocked, too controlled for the desperation coursing through him. Footsteps sounded on the other side. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with a kind but weary face. "Mrs. Kettering." Daniel's voice barely resembled his own. "I was told you took in a woman injured on the road." "My wife." Mary's eyes widened, first with surprise, then with a tight, cautious relief. "Come in, Your Grace," she said, stepping aside. "But there is something you must hear before you see her." A cold knot tightened in Daniel's stomach. "Tell me." Mary drew a breath. "She's alive. She's healing. But—" Her gaze drifted briefly toward the room behind her, as if the truth itself was sitting there. "She's lost her memory. All of it. She remembers nothing. Her name, her life before the fall. You. She won't know who you are." The words struck like a blow. Daniel needed a heartbeat, just one, to steady himself. She was here, close enough to touch, and she did not know him. "May I see her?" he asked, though the question scraped out of him as little more than breath. "Please." Mary nodded and led him down a narrow corridor scented with soup, herbs, and burning wood. Daniel's pulse pounded so loudly he could hear nothing else. Then he saw her. Lavinia sat near the hearth, wrapped in a simple dress too large for her, hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen. She looked fragile, pale, yet more alive than she had seemed in years, and when her eyes met his, Daniel stopped. There was no recognition, no flicker of relief, nothing. Only the tentative curiosity one reserves for a stranger. He stepped forward. "Lavinia," he said, her name spilling from him like a prayer, hoarse and aching. She rose slowly, and the faint step she took back, instinctive, almost imperceptible, cut the air from his lungs. Mary laid a steadying hand on her shoulder. "This is the Duke of Somerville," she said gently. "Your husband." Lavinia's gaze lingered on him. Her eyes were beautiful, soft, and empty. No memory, no connection. Only silence. I'm sorry," she whispered at last, her voice almost apologetic. "I don't remember. I don't remember you. I don't remember anything." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, not from pain, but from something deeper, breaking open inside him. He had crossed counties without sleep, knocked on doors, pleaded for news, chased rumours through rain and mud. He had carved a path of desperation across half of Yorkshire, and now standing before the woman he had searched for with every desperate breath, he was no one to her. "You owe no apology," he managed, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. "What matters is that you're safe, alive." He swallowed. "Whenever you feel ready, I can take you home. There are doctors, servants, comfort, whatever you may need." Lavinia studied him, expression unreadable. Her hand drifted to the ring hanging from the cord Mary had fashioned, fingers closing around the gold as if it were both anchor and warning. "I don't know if I should return," she murmured. The words hit harder than any fear he had carried. It wasn't only that she did not remember him. It was that the life he offered her held no pull, no sense of belonging, no faint tug of safety. "Why?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Is there something you fear?" Lavinia looked away. Her silence held an answer she could not yet speak, and in that silence Daniel understood something simple, devastating, undeniable. He had found her, but he had not gotten her back. Perhaps he never had her at all, even before the accident. The fire crackled between them, drawing light and shadow across a gulf he now realized had existed long before memory left her. And Daniel understood with a quiet, dawning certainty. This reunion, so feverishly sought, so desperately feared, resolved nothing. It was merely the beginning. Chapter 7. The Fear of Returning. Lavinia couldn't look away from him. The man, Daniel, Mary had said, stood in the center of the modest room, rain dripping from the hem of his coat, exhaustion hollowing his eyes. But there was something else there too, deeper than fatigue. A kind of longing, or loss, or an absence that felt strangely familiar even to her blank, bruised mind. He looked at her the way a man looks at something precious he doesn't quite know how to hold, with reverence and fear. "I don't expect you to decide anything now," he said softly, each word shaped with deliberate care. "Take whatever time you need. Only allow me to see to your comfort. I can take you home. Home." The word fell between them like something fragile and foreign. Lavinia glanced around Mary's cottage, the quiet crackle of the fire, the scent of herbs hanging from the beams, the warmth of bread cooling on the table. This small place was all she knew, all she understood. But home? Whatever that had meant before was now little more than a silhouette, blurred, distant, unsettling. "I don't even know who I am," she whispered at last, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I don't know who you are. How could I return to a life I cannot remember, to a man who is—" She hesitated, but the truth came anyway. "A stranger to me." The emotion that crossed his face was so raw she instinctively stepped back. But Daniel did not move toward her. He only lowered his eyes, exhaling slowly as if searching for steadiness somewhere inside himself. "I understand," he said quietly. "But perhaps I could help you remember. Tell you who you were, who you are. Tell you about the life we shared." "We." The word tightened something low in her stomach. Her fingers curled around the ring hanging from the cord around her neck, his ring, apparently. A ring she must once have accepted with some kind of promise. But what promise? "Then speak," she murmured, sinking back into her chair when her knees trembled. "Tell me who I was." Daniel approached cautiously, stopping at a respectful distance. Mary nudged a chair forward for him, then slipped away, leaving them with a quiet that felt too intimate. "Your name is Lavinia Crewe," he began, voice low, almost hesitant. "Duchess of Somerville. We married 2 years ago, an arrangement made between our families. A practical match, deemed suitable for both." He paused, too long for mere memory. "You were gracious, soft-spoken. You managed our household with impeccable composure. But you were also—" His brow tightened as though honesty cost him something. "Withdrawn. And I did not know you as I should have. I didn't listen. I didn't see you." The words settled heavily in the small room. Lavinia felt a tug inside her, not quite sorrow, but recognition. A sense that the loneliness she carried now was not new. It was old, worn, familiar. "And you?" she asked, forcing him to look at her again. "Who are you?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "I am the Duke of Somerville. I've spent most of my life bound to obligations, estates, politics, family expectations. I let duty fill every corner of my days." A breath, sharp. "And in doing so, I failed you. More deeply than I understood." Mary, lingering by the doorway, wiped her eyes before slipping out entirely. Lavinia's pulse fluttered. A picture was forming, faint but unmistakable. A life lived with distance instead of affection. A marriage conducted with politeness instead of warmth. A husband who had not been cruel but simply absent. "Why was I traveling alone?" she asked suddenly. "A duchess should never be without a companion. So why was I in a carriage with only a coachman? Where was I going?" Daniel shut his eyes. The pain returned at once, sharper this time. "You wished to visit your aunt," he answered. "You said you needed quiet, distance, air." A pause. "Your lady's maid fell ill a few days before, and you insisted you could go without her. I didn't argue. I didn't see how much you were asking for help, how much you were running from." Running. The word struck like a shard of ice. She wasn't merely traveling. She had been escaping something. "And now?" she asked, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. "Now that I've vanished, now that I remember nothing, now you finally see me?" He rose so suddenly, the chair scraped against the floorboards. His breath stuttered. His hands trembled. "Yes," he said, turning toward the fire as if he needed its warmth to steady him. "Yes, only now. Because I was blind. Because I accepted silence as if it were peace. Because I lacked the courage to want more." He faced her again, and there was a sheen in his eyes that made her breath hitch. "Because it is easy to live when you've never lost anything. But to live and lose, to realize what cannot be undone." His voice faltered. "That is something else entirely." A shiver ran through her, not fear, but the shock of hearing the truth spoken without pretense. "I cannot go with you," she said softly, but with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Not yet. Not without knowing who I am, and not without knowing what I want, not without choosing." The words hung in the air like a boundary drawn with trembling hands. He could have taken her. He could have claimed his right, invoked the law, the title, the marriage. But he didn't. He didn't even move. Daniel only nodded, a slow, painful gesture of surrender. "Then I will remain here," he said, steadier than she expected. "At the inn, and I will wait. I won't force you to return. But I won't leave you unprotected either. I will stay until you decide." Another breath, this one uneven, as though dragging the words from deep inside. "And if your decision is not to return," he swallowed, "I will accept it." A pause, raw, vulnerable, honest. "But I will pray every day that it is not so." Lavinia had expected commands, ultimatums, the weight of a title pressed against her will. She had not expected humility. Something opened inside her then. Not memory, not yet, but a spark, a question, a beginning. "Very well," she whispered. "Stay." And for the first time since waking in that strange little room, the silence between them felt less like an abyss, and more like the first fragile thread of something new. Chapter 8. The Man Who Learns to See. The Millbrook Inn was small and damp, its stone walls clinging to the chill and its low ceiling creaking with every gust of wind. Daniel was not accustomed to such cramped quarters, but he uttered no complaint. Lavinia was only a few houses away, alive, and that was enough. Burton, his long-time valet, moved about the room with his usual quiet efficiency, though the place was an insult to his standards. "The bed is hardly suitable for a gentleman, Your Grace," he observed, eyeing the thin mattress with restrained disapproval. "It doesn't matter," Daniel replied, shrugging off his wet coat. "We'll remain as long as needed." Burton inclined his head. He said nothing more, but Daniel read the thought anyway. A duke did not belong in a place like this. Still, Burton would follow him to the edge of England without a word of protest. In the days that followed, Daniel kept his distance. To approach Lavinia too quickly would be a mistake. Each morning he and Burton walked the narrow lanes, Daniel carrying himself with an unconscious aristocratic composure that no cloak or mud could hide. He saw Lavinia only when chance allowed, when she stepped outside Mary's cottage for a breath of air, when she gathered laundry from the line, when she lingered in the small herb garden. And each glimpse revealed something he had never bothered to notice before. The way she pressed her fingers to her temple when a memory slipped away. The way she pinched the edge of her skirt when she felt unsteady. 2 years of marriage, and he was only now learning to see her. Mary noticed him watching from afar. One rainy afternoon, she approached the inn with a cup of warm tea. "Don't rush her," she advised gently but firmly. "Your presence is enough. When she's ready, she'll take a step." Daniel nodded. He who had lived a lifetime acting decisively now found himself learning the strange discipline of waiting and accepting it. On the third day, he acted with careful intention. He sent Burton with a stack of fine, dry firewood for Mary, long, clean cuts meant to last through cold nights. Burton delivered them with his usual discretion, while Daniel remained a few paces back, far enough not to startle Lavinia with his shadow. She appeared at the window. Her gaze landed on Burton, then on Daniel. She did not smile, but she didn't step away either. A crack in the wall she kept between them, a beginning. On the fourth day, Mary mentioned her chicken yard gate needed mending. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Burton, see to it." While Burton worked with neat efficiency, Daniel held the lantern and spoke with Mary about the village, the harvest, recent illnesses, the winter's hardships. It struck him as faintly ironic that here, among strangers, he was acting more like a true duke than he had inside his own home. Lavinia appeared in the doorway just as Burton tightened the final hinge. She watched them silently. Something new lingered in her eyes, not just caution but curiosity. "You supervise well," she said, a small, shy flicker of humor in her voice. Daniel turned, surprised she had spoken first. "Just doing what I can," he answered, careful not to sound eager. She considered that then, fleeting as a breath. She smiled. A small, uncertain, unmistakably real smile. Burton bent, as if adjusting his coat, hiding the satisfied grin tugging at his mouth. On the fifth day, Daniel found her alone for the first time. She sat by the stream, bare feet in the cold water, face turned toward the pale afternoon sun. Burton spotted her first and cast Daniel a quiet warning glance. "Approach gently." Daniel obeyed. He walked toward her with deliberate lightness. "May I sit?" he asked, stopping at a respectful distance. She studied him, that newly familiar evaluating look, and nodded. He settled onto the damp grass, hands clasped loosely between his knees. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was waiting. "Mary said you've been unsettled at night," he murmured. "She hesitated to tell me, but she felt I should know." Lavinia kept her gaze on the water. "I don't know if they're memories. They feel like being trapped, wanting to scream, but no sound comes." Then she looked at him, deeply, searchingly. "Was I like that before?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. When he answered, he did not soften the truth. "I think you felt unseen, not because I meant you harm, but because I wasn't paying attention. I took up all the space and offered none in return. You were there, and I didn't see you." She absorbed that, the current shifting around her ankles. "And you?" she asked quietly. "Where were you?" The question struck harder than expected. "On the edges," he said simply. "Fulfilling roles, meeting expectations. Doing everything except living." She turned toward him, and for the first time since the accident there was real understanding in her eyes. "Then, perhaps we were both trapped," she said, "in different ways, but trapped nonetheless." The truth settled in him with a painful, necessary clarity. "Lavinia, may I ask you something?" She nodded. "I'm not asking you to remember, or to return to a life you don't recognize. But if you could choose now, based only on what you see before you, would you allow me to try? Not as a duke, Not as the husband who failed you, but as the man sitting here." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she extended her hand. Her fingers brushed his, light, tremulous, but real. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered. "I don't know if I want to return to what was. But I want to see who you are now." She released his hand slowly. "Maybe that's a beginning." Daniel felt something stir in him, something he had buried years ago. Hope. Not the hope of recovering a past he likely did not deserve, but of building a future worthy of her choosing. And for the first time since the letter arrived in London, he let himself breathe. Chapter 9. When the Heart Remembers. That morning, when the sun slipped through the wavy glass of the small window, Lavinia woke without the familiar sense of falling into an endless pit. The anguish was still there, lodged somewhere deep, but it was no longer everything. There was something else now. A fragile calm, thin as a thread someone had just begun to weave inside her. Perhaps it was the simple rhythm of Mary's house, the smell of bread baking, the clatter of pans, the floorboards creaking in all the same places. Or perhaps it was because of the man who now belonged to her days, not as a memory, but as a presence. Daniel. His name no longer felt foreign. It did not conjure clear images of the past, but it had stopped being the name of a stranger and become the name of a man she was slowly, carefully learning to watch. Not the distant duke he had once been, but the man who came to Millbrook every morning in a rain-worn coat, always with Burton at his side, always with eyes too observant for someone raised to be served. Lavinia dressed with care, still in Mary's altered gowns, simple and practical, and braided her hair with a surer hand than in the first days. When she went downstairs, Mary was already at the table, wearing a smile that hinted at news. "This arrived early," she said, nodding toward a basket. "From His Grace. Burton brought it." Inside, Lavinia found fresh bread, good butter, small jars of jam, and, nestled among them, a little posy of wildflowers, daisies, buttercups, sprigs of lavender. She brushed the petals with her fingertips. Common flowers, no doubt picked along the roadside, but there was care in the way they'd been gathered and tied with a scrap of ribbon. They said, "I thought of you." And then suddenly, something loosened inside her. A brief flash cut through the haze. For an instant, Lavinia was no longer in Mary's modest kitchen. She was in a different place, a vast garden with gravel paths and perfectly drawn beds. Roses in strict rows, hedges trimmed to flawless shapes, a fountain at the center. Sunlight poured over pale stone, belonging to a much larger house. She was standing there with a bouquet in her hands. The flowers were more formal, more arranged, more correct. She remembered smiling for the benefit of the servants, remembered saying something like, "They are very pretty," and feeling utterly hollow inside. Remembered the moment they withdrew, leaving her alone with the heavy weight of a smile that did not belong to her face, alone in a place that was supposed to be her home. She blinked, and the image shattered. Mary's kitchen came back into focus. The basket, the wildflowers, the widow's watchful eyes. But one certainty remained. The life she had lost might have been orderly, elegant, comfortable. That did not make it happy. "Mary," she murmured, gaze still fixed on the flowers. Where is he?" "At the inn, I imagine," Mary replied after studying her for a moment. "He usually takes his breakfast there." Lavinia drew her shawl around her shoulders. She didn't think about propriety, about what would be expected of a duchess, or about what people might say. There was a restless pull inside her now, and something new and unfamiliar. She did not want to wait for him to come. She wanted to go. "I'm going to see him," she said, more to herself than to Mary. Mary did not try to stop her. She only laid a gentle hand on Lavinia's arm. "Go then and come back when you're ready." The inn was quiet at that hour. 2 village men sat in a corner with their mugs, talking low. Daniel was by the window, a cup of tea in front of him, just as he had been on other mornings. His face still bore the strain of the past weeks, but the raw desperation had eased. There was less panic now, more waiting. When he saw her, he rose at once. Surprise flickered first, then something too bright to conceal. Hope. "Lavinia." She stopped by the table, keenly aware of the brief, curious glances that surfaced, and then quickly pretended to look elsewhere. Her fingers tightened on the edges of her shawl. "I wanted "To thank you," she began, looking down at the little bouquet she still held, "for the flowers, and for everything else, all the things you've been doing, for not forcing me to be someone I no longer remember." He seemed to search for his words. "I'm the one who should thank you," he said at last. "For coming. I'd like to offer more than baskets and flowers, but for now this is what I know how to give without demanding anything in return." A gentler silence settled over the small table. "May I sit?" she asked. "Of course." He pulled out the chair with a controlled motion. "Burton will bring tea." The valet appeared almost at once, as if he had been waiting just beyond the door. He poured a fresh cup with precise movements, greeted her with the respect due her rank, and withdrew to another table, close enough to be summoned, far enough not to overhear. Lavinia watched the steam curl between them, drawing pale patterns in the air. "Tell me something," she said suddenly. "Something you loved before the title and all of this. Something that made you forget the world was watching." Daniel looked genuinely taken aback by the question. He ran a finger along the rim of the cup, as though the porcelain might help him find the answer. "Horses," he said at last. "When I was young, I bred them. There was one in particular, Atlas." A brief, unguarded smile softened his face. "Stubborn, proud, but loyal. I would ride with no destination, simply for the feel of speed, of wind. It was the only time I wasn't being measured or judged." The smile faded. "My father called it a waste of time. He said dukes aren't born to ride without purpose. When I inherited the title, I sold Atlas. I thought that was what was expected." Lavinia listened, and without knowing his entire story, she recognized the ache beneath it, the ache of giving up something that was truly yours in order to fit into a shape the world demanded. "And me?" she asked quietly, the question tightening her throat. "What did I love?" He looked at her, as if the question hurt more than any accusation. "I don't know," he answered, voice rough. "I never asked. I never had the courage, or the sense to truly want to know. But I see now that the signs were there. Your rooms were always full of books. You would disappear into a sitting room almost no one used, and stare out the window as if you were somewhere else entirely." He paused. "I should have listened. I didn't." Books. The word lit something inside her. Not a full memory, but a feeling. The smell of old pages. The weight of an open volume resting on her lap. The quiet comfort of finding in someone else's sentences the things she could never say aloud. Lavinia drew a steadying breath. "Read to me," she said, almost on impulse. "Tonight. Mary has a few books. Read and perhaps I'll remember. Or perhaps I won't. But I want to hear your voice say words that aren't duty." Daniel looked at her with a kind of startled gratitude. "If that is what you want," he replied, inclining his head, "then I will come." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he laid his hand on the table, palm up, not crossing the full distance between them, only offering. Lavinia studied that hand, broad, steady, bearing calluses that could not be old. Fear whispered that it was too soon, but the fragile calm inside her whispered back that perhaps it was not. She let her fingertips rest lightly against his. Not enough to entwine. Just enough so there was contact. "I don't know who I'll be when my memories return," she said simply. "But I do know I will not go back to being a shadow. Not in your house. Not in my own life." "I don't want you to be," he murmured. "That is how I lost you." She withdrew her hand first. They talked a while longer, of small things. Millbrook, the village doctor, some old story Mary had told the night before. When she rose to leave, Daniel did not escort her back to Mary's door. He respected that invisible boundary. He only watched as she walked away, following her with his eyes until she vanished around the bend. He came that night. Mary prepared the little sitting room, coaxed the fire back to life and placed a book on the table, a volume of poems she kept carefully wrapped when not in use. Then she turned to Lavinia with a look that held both farewell and faith. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. "If you need me, call." Daniel arrived shortly after, shedding a damp coat in the doorway. He greeted Mary with courteous warmth, then, when they were alone, moved with a restraint that made every gesture feel deliberate, as if he feared one wrong move might shatter something delicate between them. He took a chair by the hearth. She sat opposite, the flames a small blaze between them. He opened the book with care. The pages were yellowed at the edges. "It's an old volume," he remarked. "Mary says it belonged to her husband." Lavinia only nodded. Her heart was pounding too loudly for speech. He began to read. The verses were simple, of fields and seasons, of passing time, of losses no one can quite outrun. His voice was low and steady, filling the room and making it seem larger than it was. The walls, the firelight, even the shadows stretching to listen. Lavinia closed her eyes. At one point he read a poem about a great house full of echoes, where someone wandered the corridors feeling more alone than if they had been out in the open. Something inside her flinched. The vision came like a sudden gust. She was in a long corridor with thick rugs and portraits on the walls. She knew, with the quiet certainty memory grants, that this was Somerville Hall. She walked alone, holding a book to her chest because it was the only thing in the house that felt entirely hers. The library door stood ajar, and from within she heard his voice, Daniel's, reading aloud. Not to her. To a group of men, perhaps, or to servants. Or simply to fill an empty evening. She stopped by the door listening, her face half in shadow. She wanted to enter. She wanted that voice to be for her as well. But in the end, she moved on, unseen, uncalled, the words passing through the door, and never reaching her. The memory cut clean and deep. Mary's sitting room returned, the fire crackling, the book in Daniel's hands, the weight of the past settling beside the present. "Lavinia?" His voice had changed. "What is it?" She realized she was gripping the arm of her chair. She opened her eyes slowly. Tears had gathered, not many, but enough for him to see. "I remembered," she whispered. "Not everything. Just a corridor at Somerville Hall. And you, reading. Somewhere I wasn't." He drew in a sharp breath. "And how did you feel?" he asked gently, as though touching an open wound. She inhaled and exhaled once, refusing the easy lie. "Lonely," she said. "Lonely in a house that was supposed to be mine. I remember the feeling before the images. I remember what it was like to exist beside you without ever truly being with you." Silence stretched, heavy, but survivable. Daniel closed the book carefully and laid it on the table, as if the object itself now bore witness to what had passed between them. "I did that to you," he said quietly. "I gave you a house and never gave you a home." She didn't argue. The truth was a visitor long overdue. Denying it would have been another kind of cruelty. Then softly she said, "But tonight, when you read, it didn't hurt in the same way." He looked up, startled. "It didn't?" "No," she repeated, "because this time I wasn't standing outside the door." The words fell between them, simple and yet immense. She drew a breath, feeling both the weight and the relief of what she was about to say. "Daniel." It was the first time she spoke his name with full awareness, and he flinched as if the sound of it from her lips struck somewhere unguarded. "I want to go back to Somerville Hall," she said at last. "Not because I must, not because society expects it, but because that house is part of who I am, and I no longer wish to be afraid of it. And—" her gaze found his, steady now. "I want to return with the man you are trying to become, not with the one who left me walking alone through the corridors." For a moment he didn't answer. Daniel's features shifted under the strain of too many emotions. Disbelief, sorrow, hope, remorse, and a kind of relief so intense it looked almost like pain. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I can't promise I won't fail," he said, "but I can promise I won't let you walk those corridors alone again. If you'll allow it, I'll be beside you, and if I falter, I want you to tell me. I don't wish to live blind any longer." She rose carefully, her legs still remembering the fall and its frailties. She crossed the small distance between them. For a heartbeat, she considered taking his hand. Instead, she rested her palm on his shoulder, a simple gesture, yet more intimate than anything she had ever allowed, even in the fractured glimpses of their past. "Then take me home," she said. "And this time let's learn the way together." For a few seconds, Daniel only closed his eyes as if he needed the darkness to contain everything that surged in him. When he opened them again, there was something new there, not the arrogance of a man accustomed to winning, but the humility of one who knows he has been given a second chance he did not earn and intends to guard it fiercely. He rose. He didn't embrace her. He didn't pull her close. He merely inclined his head, as if accepting a command spoken like a request. "When you're ready," he said quietly, "Somerville Hall will be ready as well, and I will do everything in my power to deserve it." Lavinia nodded. Her stubborn heart pounded too fast. Her mind was still a landscape of shadows, but some of them had edges now, and for the first time, the thought of returning did not feel like stepping back into a prison. It felt like the beginning of something that one day might truly be called home. Chapter 10. The house that finally belongs to them both. Somerville Hall looked different, not because the stones had changed, nor because the rooms were any less grand. The walls were still high, the portraits still hung where they always had, the chandeliers still watched from above. And yet, the way the light entered through the tall windows that morning made everything feel less imposing, less cold. Or perhaps it was simply because, this time, Lavinia was not walking in alone. A few weeks had passed since that night by Mary's hearth when she had asked to return. Winter had begun to loosen its grip, making room for a hesitant spring when Daniel insisted on delaying their departure. "There are things I must set right in Millbrook," he'd said, "debts I owed and never knew." Lavinia hadn't argued. She simply watched. There were no grand gestures, no speeches. The Duke did not try to replace the vicar or the magistrate. He merely listened, something he had by all accounts rarely done. He spoke with the pastor about the church roof that had leaked for 3 winters and offered timber and wages for the carpenters. He brought a physician from Harrogate and arranged more frequent visits to the village under his patronage. He helped the blacksmith obtain better tools, quietly paid the debt of a farmer whose crops had been ruined by the rains. He did not take up a hammer or climb a roof. That would have been a performance. Instead, he stood by, not as a distant lord, but as someone who, at last, wished to understand the weight of the work he had always ordered done without looking. Burton moved with him as ever, but the man's expression had changed as well. There was a quiet pride in his gaze, as if he were finally seeing the boy he'd once served become the man he'd always had the makings of. Lavinia saw it all, in silence. And the conclusion she carried with her day after day was simple. He was not playing a part for her benefit. This was a decision he had made for himself. On the eve of their departure, she found Mary by the window of the small house where she had first woken without a name. Mary's valise was already shut, the sheet folded over the back of a chair, her few belongings gathered in a neat bundle. "You can still change your mind," Lavinia said softly. "No one would blame you for staying." Mary adjusted the shawl at her shoulders and gave a tired, tender smile. "I've already lived a whole life here, dear, and if I were to end my days in this village, I wouldn't be unhappy." Her gaze gentled, "But I never imagined the good Lord would give me another life in another house, because someone walked through my door without a name and without a past." "I'm the one who was given a life in this house," Lavinia replied. "If not for this place." The sentence trailed off, but it didn't need finishing. They both knew. They stood in quiet for a moment, listening to the sounds of the street, cartwheels, familiar voices, the everyday rhythm that would soon be behind them. "I don't want to take only the old Somerville Hall back with me," Lavinia went on, barely above a whisper. "I want to take what I found here, your care, your honesty, you—" She straightened, her voice firmer. "And I won't go back to that house without someone who'll remind me every day that I have the right to exist in it." Mary drew in a breath, her eyes shining. "Then I'll go," she said simply, "as a lady's companion, if we need a grand title. But in my heart, I'll be what sempre fui, the woman who adds a little more water to the tea when the world is too strong for you to swallow." Lavinia smiled. It was the perfect bargain. The journey back was shorter than she had feared, perhaps because, for the first time, the fear of returning was smaller than the desire not to run. She shared the carriage with Mary. Daniel rode ahead, vigilant but never intruding on their space. Burton rode alongside, as discreet as a faithful shadow. When the carriage finally drew up before the main steps, Lavinia remained seated for a few seconds, looking out through the window. The house stared back at her like an old portrait, imposing, familiar, and strange all at once. Daniel opened the door and offered his hand. He did not pull. He simply waited. Lavinia set her fingers in his and stepped down. The touch felt like a thread linking past and present, no longer a chain, but a ribbon that might be loosened, tightened, mended. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he said quietly. It didn't sound like an announcement. It sounded almost like a prayer. She drew in a slow breath, eyes still on the facade. "Let's see if we can make it to home at last," she replied. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood, recently snuffed candles and old memories. The servants stood in a discreet line along the hall. Some recognized her, others knew only that she was their mistress. All of them bowed with contained respect. Mary followed a step behind, eyes keen, absorbing the world she had known only from stories. "Are you ready?" Daniel murmured at Lavinia's side. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm here." For now, that will have to be enough. He accepted that answer as if it were the best he could hope for. In the days that followed, a new kind of routine began to take shape, not a return to what had been, but something built from what each of them now brought. In the mornings, Lavinia spent time in the gardens, now a little less symmetrical, a little more alive. She asked that some of the beds be replanted with simple flowers like the ones in Millbrook, marigolds, wild herbs, colors with no pretension. Mary walked with her, talking about the weather, laughing as she remembered some neighbor from the village. In the afternoons, there were books, always books. Sometimes Lavinia read alone. Sometimes she asked Daniel to read aloud. Poems that no longer hurt, essays that made her laugh, passages that stirred memories without drowning her in them. The past came and went like the tide, and she had learned, at last, how to swim. Daniel visited the estates with an altered posture. He returned with mud on his boots, road dust on his coat, and something different in his eyes when he spoke of a school they might build, a barn that needed shoring up, families who could be helped before they fell. Burton watched it all from the edges, as discreet as ever. But now and then, when he thought no one was looking, a small smile would escape him, the quiet approval of a man who liked the direction his master had finally chosen. One afternoon, Lavinia sat in the library, the room that had once been refuge and exclusion both. Now the door was often left open. 2 armchairs stood by the window, and more than once she'd found a book left there by Daniel, marked with a ribbon, a silent invitation to share. He entered without fuss, pausing in the doorway as if asking permission without a word. "Mary is teaching the cook how to make Millbrook stew," he announced, a hint of amusement touching his mouth. "I don't believe Somerville Hall has ever seen anything like it." Lavinia pictured the scene and felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Then Somerville Hall is no longer only your house," she said. "It's a little bit hers now, too." "And yours." He moved a few steps closer. "For the first time, truly." She closed the book in her lap, slowly. "There's still so much I don't remember," she confessed, "but I'm starting to think that may not be what matters most. We can't change what we were. What we will be—" She met his gaze. "At least we can try." Daniel took another step, just enough that the light from the window fell over them both. "That is what I want," he said simply. "To try. Every day. With you." He held out his hand, that old gesture, now remade into a promise. Lavinia placed her hand in his, this time without the slightest hesitation. There were no grand proclamations, no dramatic declarations. The love that was forming, or perhaps returning in a different shape, no longer needed them. It was enough to have the quiet sounds of the house around them, the distant crackle of a fire, the murmur of Mary's voice in the kitchen, the familiar weight of a book resting in Lavinia's other hand. It was enough to know that in that moment, neither of them was walking alone. It was not exactly a return. It was a beginning. Epilogue. 3 years of spring. 3 years had passed since the day Lavinia stepped once more across the threshold of Somerville Hall, her hand in Daniel's, unsure of everything except the quiet bravery it took to return. Spring had come and gone many times since then, some harsh, some gentle, but the season had settled into the house as surely as laughter now settled in its halls. Lavinia moved with calm confidence, her hair pinned loosely as the breeze played through it, her free hand resting over the firm curve of her belly. She was expecting again, their second child. There was no loneliness, no uncertainty, only warmth. The little girl at her side toddled along the garden path with determined steps, fist closed around a fistful of daisies she had been collecting with grave concentration. Her dark curls bounced with each wobbling stride. When she stumbled, Lavinia steadied her without effort, smiling as the child pressed one of the crushed daisies proudly into her palm. "Thank you, darling," Lavinia murmured. "Shall we give it to Papa?" The child nodded with enthusiastic seriousness and pointed toward the stable yard, where Daniel was bent over a wooden crate, sleeves rolled, boots muddy, laughing at something Burton had said. Daniel was a man transformed, not by grand gestures, but by consistent, quiet choices. He looked up the moment he sensed them, as if some instinct tugged his gaze whenever she entered a space. The way his expression softened when he saw them made Lavinia's heart warm in the same unexpected way it had the first time he smiled at her in Millbrook. "Careful, little one," he called, stooping as their daughter rushed toward him with arms unsteady and Daisy extended like an offering. Daniel scooped her into his arms with practiced ease, kissing the top of her curls before meeting Lavinia halfway down the path. "You're supposed to be resting," he murmured, brushing a wind-blown strand of hair from her cheek. "I am resting," she replied, sliding her arms around his waist. "Just while walking." Daniel shook his head in amused resignation, but his hands moved instinctively to her belly, reverent. "And how are the two of you today?" "Hungry," Lavinia said. "Both of us." "And I suspect your daughter has eaten half the herb garden already," he laughed, a sound she had once believed impossible from him. "She gets that from you." "No," Lavinia teased softly. "She gets her stubbornness from you." He kissed her then, slow and warm, the way one kisses a life that was remade from its foundations. There was no desperation in it, no apology. Only a steadiness built from years of choosing each other, through memory regained and memory lost, through fear and courage and rebirth. Mary watched from the veranda, smiling behind her apron, her presence as much a part of Somerville Hall as its stone walls. Their home was full now, of books scattered across reading chairs, of children's toys, of sunlight that no longer felt cold. And as Daniel wrapped an arm around Lavinia while their daughter nestled sleepily between them, she thought, with a certainty as sure as spring returning, this was the life they built together, not the one fate had written, but the one they had chosen.